Programming is all about being precise and explicit when we are giving instruction to the system. But we cannot be perfect all the time, and we make mistakes. And our program will contain some errors. The solution is not to write perfect code, but to actively recognize the errors and fix them quickly. So recognizing and fixing the error is an art that every developer in the world needs to learn to be more efficient. What are the different types of error we see in JavaScript? Understand them and fix the error that we get. So in this video, we are going to talk about different types of error we see in JavaScript. The types of error can be syntax error, reference error, type error, range error, and a lot of time it will always be logical error. So here in this file, we have two variables, username and all users. Username contains a value of aria and all users is an array. So error is when you write code that JavaScript engine is not able to understand, and it gives you a helpful message to understand where the error is happening. Say for example, here we are saying console.log username to log the value. But what if we say console, log, then the JavaScript engine will not be able to understand it and it will say log is not defined. So this is one of the error. Going through the error message will help us understand where the error is happening so we can fix it. So we'll start with the first type of error, that is the most popular one, is called syntax error. What is syntax error? So here we are logging the value of username and by mistake I'm adding an extra parenthesis. If you refresh it here, it will throw an error saying uncaught syntax error, and it is happening from line number 7 that you can see it here, and the message says unexpected token parenthesis. It means that the code that you're passing to JavaScript engine, they're not able to understand it, and that's why it's throwing an error called syntax error. Syntax error happens whenever you mess up the grammar of the language. Grammar is when you add an extra dot or something like that. So for example, here I'm saying console and double dot and refresh it here, it will throw an error, unexpected token dot. If you remove this dot and put an extra dot after username by mistake and you refresh it here, it will throw an error saying this. So syntax error is the most common error that you'll find, and whenever you see a syntax error here, you need to understand you are messing up the grammar of the language and you need to look for any extra parenthesis, dot, or something to do with the grammar of the language. Let's move on to the next type of error, that is reference error. So let's say console.log, and here I'm just going to log a variable called user. And here we can see an error called reference error. User is not defined. Throwing a reference error because the variable you are trying to reference, that is user, is not available in this scope. Similar to that, like what if I say console.log username, and here instead of dot, what if I put a comma? And now if you refresh it, and I'll go ahead and comment the above line. Refresh it, and here it throws an error called reference error. Log is not defined. So just because we are using comma operator, it's not able to access a variable that is log, and that's why it is throwing a reference error. So whenever you see a reference error, it means that the name of the variable that you see in the message is not present in that scope. Either you need to give them access or you need to change the scope of that variable. Let's move on to next type of error, that is known as type error. As the name suggests, that it has something to do with the type of value. Say for example, here we have a variable name username that stores a value aria. So I can go ahead and say console log username and it will work properly. But what if I go ahead and say console.log and I try to call username? So here we know that username is a variable that holds a value aria, that is a string. But now here we are trying to call that variable thinking it is a function. So this type of error will throw a type error that will say username is not a function and you're trying to call it. So here username is a string and we are trying to call that. That's why we are seeing an error called username is not a function. Similarly, what if we have a variable called empty that stores the value of undefined, and we try to access some key from this variable, that is like empty dot anything like abc. And if we refresh it here, we'll see a type error, cannot read property abc of undefined. Here we are trying to access the property abc thinking empty is an object, but empty is undefined, and that's why it's throwing an error saying cannot read property abc of undefined, because undefined cannot act like an object. So whenever you change the type, like either you try to call a string or a number, or you try to access a key from a string or undefined, it will throw an error that is known as type error. So whenever you see a type error, you should always look for code where you are trying to use variable in different type. Let's move on to next type of error, that is range error. Range error is not a very common error. You will only find this error whenever you are trying to go outside of the range that is allowed. Say for example, here we have a variable named alluser. I can just change the length of alluser by saying allusers dot length is equal to 100. Now here if we try to refresh it and look at all users, you'll see the length became 100. First 3 is a value of John, Arya and Sam, but other 97 is an empty value because we changed the length of all users. What if we change the length of all users to something like 98, exponentiation operator and 45? Refresh it here and it will throw an error because this length of array is not allowed in JavaScript, and that's why it's throwing an error called range error. So it says invalid array length. There are other places where you will see this error, but it will always happen whenever you're going outside of the range that is allowed for that specific purpose. So here the purpose is the length of the array cannot go beyond certain length, and here we are going beyond that, and that's why we are seeing an error called range error. Last type of error is logical error, and I find this is the most common error that you'll find in JavaScript. And logical error is not a type of error you will see similar to what we have seen till now, like range error, type and reference. Logical is whenever there is a problem in our logic. Say I want to convert the temperature from Fahrenheit to Celsius. For that we will have to say if minus 32 and multiply it with 5 by 9. So this is what we need to do to convert Fahrenheit to Celsius. So let's take a value of 32 degree Fahrenheit. So we can just convert it to 0. If we write something like this in code, we'll see we are getting a value that is not 0. But why is that happening? And when you try to understand it, the reason it is happening is because multiplication and division operator has more precedence than subtraction operator, and that's why this operation is happening first, and that's why we are getting the output 14.22. What we needed to do is to do this operation first, and that's why we add it into a bracket, and now if we try to do that, we'll get a result called 0. So that kind of error is not going to throw any kind of error. Say if we go ahead and log the value console.log and we remove this bracket here, it will not throw any kind of error that we have seen it earlier. I'll just go ahead and comment it, refresh it, and here we can see the value. So we will not see any error for logical errors because error is in the logic we have written code in. So to fix it, we can just put brackets here and refresh it and we'll get the value 0. So whenever it is logical error, you will have to fix it by yourself, but everything else, you can just understand where the error is, whether it is syntax, reference, type, or range error. So in this way, we learned about different types of error that can help us understand at what point of time which error is thrown and how we can fix it quickly. It's not all about writing perfect code, but it's about learning a skill that is actively recognizing the error and fixing it quickly.